Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wolforst. Well, you may be watching this on Sunday. We're taping this episode Thursday, June 19th. Today marks the 5th time Juneteenth is being observed here as a federal holiday. With me now to talk about the history, impact, and legacy of this day, John Armendariz, Vice President for Inclusive Excellence at Quinnipiac University. John, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Emma. I'm very happy to be here today.
So as we said, today is Juneteenth. Yeah. So just kind of kicking off here, what does this day mean to you, and why do you think it's so important to recognize it?
Yes, so I'm a native Texan, and Juneteenth originates in Texas, and it's a holiday that celebrates when General Granger appeared on Galveston Island and informed the enslaved individuals there that they were free. And so for myself, growing up as a native Texan, it was always a day that I was cognizant of because there were celebrations throughout Texas and the communities that I lived in. And so it has a meaning to me because as a Texan, I'm proud of Texas' place in ensuring that slavery truly ended in America.
Yeah. And talking a little bit more about that history, can you just go over a little bit more detail again about what this day actually commemorates? Yeah,
so most people aren't aware of the fact that while the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in 1863, many of the Confederates in the South did not listen to that. And so Texas became a safe haven for slave owners who moved to Texas because it wasn't an active part of the Civil War, and almost 250,000 slaves were in Texas. And so when the Civil War ended in April, when General Lee signed the surrender in Appomattox, 2 months later, General Granger shows up in Texas and discovers that there were people who were not aware that they had been freed. And so he issued what is called General Order Number 3, and it's a 4-sentence proclamation, but part of it says all enslaved people are now free. And so that is the origin of why on June 19th, 160 years ago today, this holiday started. And originally didn't start off as a holiday known as Juneteenth. It became a celebration in black communities. A Jubilee celebration was often what it was referred to early on, but just a celebration of the fact that they gained their freedom on June 19th, mostly in the South. And in other southern states, because as people migrate, they tend to bring their traditions and their culture and their celebrations with them. So you would see similar celebrations in the South. And then around 1872 in Texas, Reverend Yates bought a park where they would celebrate the Jubilee celebration, and it became known as Emancipation Park. And so in around 1890 is when the name changed slowly to Juneteenth, which is a combination of June and 19.
Gotcha. You mentioned, how this also referred to as Jubilee Day, about jubilation, and it is so much about celebration and celebrating that freedom, of course. But we know a lot of this is also about honoring and education. You talked about being a native Texan, so this has kind of always been in your sphere, but for a lot of us on the East Coast, and as I mentioned, only a few years that this has been a federal holiday, how do you think people can really honor this day and educate themselves and their families?
Yes, I mean, it's a great opportunity to expand horizons. I work at Quinnipiac University, and we want our students to be global citizens, to be curious, to be lifelong learners, to have an impact in the community. And so it's a great opportunity for families to take their kids to participate in these things, to learn about the history of the country. Too many Americans don't know the history of their own country, right? They don't know the experiences that people have had. And the more we do that and understand things about each other, the better we become allies for each other. So it's a great opportunity for families to introduce their kids to the history of the United States and the history of some of our communities in the United States.
And kind of coming off of that a little bit, we have seen people dismiss Black oppression as something of the past. Juneteenth, of course, recognizes the history and historical atrocities as well. But, we are still seeing things even in our own state. And in recent years past, we've seen things like nooses at schools in Connecticut or white supremacy messages painted on murals, right by our state capitol. Hate is still obviously an everyday reality for multiple minority communities. How do you think people can start to sort of confront that or deconstruct that in their own communities?
I like to think of, if you think about June 19th and Juneteenth, is really recognizing that freedom delayed is freedom denied, right? And often you hear that justice delayed is justice denied. And too many minority communities face that justice delayed and justice denied. And so I think the more we become aware of that and where that plays out and how these things affect different communities. I often tell people that poverty is a thief of opportunity. It doesn't care what the color of your skin is, your gender, your religion. It affects everyone in a similar way in that it keeps them from opportunities, right? And so the more we learn about these things and how different communities are affected and what the history is and why that is, we're able to say that's not right. And it could happen to me. Right? And I think that's what people take for granted. When we sit around and we watch things happen to different communities, it could very well happen to your community as well.
And we've seen over the past few years here that this has been a federal holiday. We've seen the Juneteenth flag raising at the state capitol, a lot of different celebrations. I know I've covered myself Juneteenth Day at the state capitol with dancing and panel discussions and music and things like that. You know, how do you sort of see these celebrations popping up across the state of Connecticut? And just for yourself, have you noticed more of them in the past few years?
I mean, as I shared, when I first came here, almost none. I know the city of Norwich, the NAACP is recognized as having the first Juneteenth celebration here in Connecticut in 1989. But, you know, over time, celebrations change and morph. If you think about the history of the country, the 4th of July wasn't recognized as a holiday until 1870, right? And so it took a while for it to take root. So I think over time, as we become cognizant of the importance of this holiday and the importance of the holiday to the Black community and to America as a whole, right? Because it's really celebrating the ideals of America, that people are entitled to life, liberty, and you know, equal opportunity. And so as that takes root, I think you'll see the celebration morph over time, and you'll see a consistency of practice in different communities where, whether it's a parade or fireworks or, you know, guest speakers or recognizing people in the community, you'll see more of that happening.
You touched on this a little bit already a few questions back, but is there any sort of message you have for those who are, you know, trying to learn more about this or looking at this and saying, well, I'm not a part of the Black community, I don't need to participate in that? What would you say to them?
Yeah, you know, as I shared earlier, at Quinnipiac, we want our students to be that global citizen, to be curious, right? It's okay to be curious, but be respectfully curious. I always tell people, there's nothing wrong with asking a question, just be conscious of how you ask that question. Don't make assumptions about others. You know, do something that's called perspective getting, where you ask someone and you don't assume things about them. Right. And so if you do those things, people are more apt to be responsive, right? I always encourage people, you know, if you ask a stranger something in a polite way, they're more likely to respond to you in a polite way versus if you're rude to them, right? And so, you know, take some time, you know, maybe practice in advance, think about what you're going to ask, become cognizant of things that might not be okay to ask. I always tell people, if you think about food, you know, one person's delicacy is another person's disgust. Right? And so don't go up to someone and say, what's that gross thing you're eating? You know, I'm curious. I've never seen that before. What are you eating, right? You're still asking a bit in a respectful way. So think about how you can respectfully engage with other people to soothe your curiosity, to ask those questions.
And we talked about sort of an increase in festivities and celebrations of Juneteenth over the past few years, especially here in Connecticut. But we do know that multiple Juneteenth events across the country have either been adapted or even canceled this year after many have reported losing financial sponsorships and compensation. And a lot of them have cited pushback around diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that we've seen, you know, coming from the White House, coming from this current administration. You know, especially in your position, Vice President for Inclusive Excellence at QU, you know, what does it kind of mean to see these broad-reaching impacts of this pushback against DEI?
Yeah, it's unfortunate because we're not where we need to be as a society. There are lots of statistics that still show inequity, whether it's gender inequity, racial inequity. I mentioned socioeconomic status earlier.
Sure.
And so I think it's short-sighted when large organizations pull back, because the reality is that the demographics of America is going to continue to get more diverse, right? And the community you ignore or offend today might be the community you look to sell something to or you need for your labor force. Right. And communities have long histories for remember who slighted them. Right? So I do think it's misguided when you see some of this pullback, because the reality is the world will continue to change. And there are some companies that are suffering in the marketplace because they have pulled back from their diversity efforts. And so, I would encourage companies to think of other ways to support organizations, that don't offend their current administration, that still are legally allowable. Most of the diversity efforts are legally allowable.
Yeah.
Hosting a parade, there's nothing illegal about having a parade. It's open in the public. Anyone can come. No one's being excluded. So there really is no harm in supporting those types of things.
We have seen some of those impacts here in Connecticut as well, with some of the things on a state level that are trying to be done or taught or celebrated or what have you. But we do know that our state legislature and our elected leaders here in Connecticut have tried to be at the forefront for, diversity in many forms. Is there anything that you think residents here or, the state could be doing to kind of further acknowledgement and celebration of something like Juneteenth?
Yeah, I think, get involved, having worked at nonprofits and done things in the community, there's always a need for volunteers. Find out how you can be a volunteer, whether it's the local library or the committee putting on the parade, however you want to support it. Find ways to do that. There's no shortage of opportunities to be involved in our communities. And so I think if people just started there, and most parades have a committee organizing it, just reach out to them and find out what kind of help do you need. You'll be surprised with what they will say.
And is there any top thing you hope people take away from Juneteenth? As we mentioned at the top, people will be watching this a few days after, but we do know that since it falls on a Thursday this year, there are a lot of celebrations that are happening, the weekends around June 19th. So is there any, top thing from this holiday you hope people take away?
Yeah, I would encourage people to know the history of the U.S., know what the meaning of Juneteenth is about and what it celebrates, right? We all have these ideals as America. We're proud to be Americans. But Juneteenth is the epitome of that because it freed the last of the enslaved people in America. Right? And so I know that people are going to see this after the holiday. I would encourage them to make plans for next year, right? Find out if your community had something, make plans to go, but make plans to go through all the heritage celebrations that happen. I have twin boys that are 14. When they were younger, we would take them to the Greek festival. I want them to experience other cultures. So Connecticut has that, the Northeast has that. So spend the rest of the year looking at the calendar and explore, be curious. Like I said, we want our students to be. As an adult, we can do the same thing.
Well, John, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. We still have more to get to here, though, on The Real Story. After 2 months, an agreement has been reached between the UConn Health System and insurer Connecticut. Coming up, we'll speak with the CEO of UConn Health about what this means for patients.